You're young enough to go in this life. I'm still going. Anyway, since we start on this particular track, I always have a sort of a table of contents in my head when I start out. And if I'm talking at the end of the conference, which I like to do because then no one can contradict me and I can go on forever without them pulling the hook. By the time I get to what I'm going to be talking about, I forget what I was going to be talking about because there's so much other interesting stuff that people have been talking about that I want to comment on. But this time, since Craig introduces me like that, let me start it this way. Obviously, my subject is Egypt, and I often start a lecture with this line because it tends to wake people up out of their torpor, which has now been going on all afternoon, and that is that Egypt is like sex. That gets everybody's attention. Why is Egypt like sex? And I mean this quite literally, because you can read all about it, and that's a certain kind of information, accurate, no doubt. And you can look at pictures, that's a different kind of emotion of information that hits a different center. That's interesting too. But in fact, you can't understand sex until you have experienced it, period. You can know a lot, but you can't understand it. And Egypt is exactly like that. You can read books from now till doomsday. And if you think this, by the way, is a plug for my trips, it is. If you think that you can read from now till doomsday, and there are a ton of good books out there now, and some that are not so good, and you can look at all of the wonderful pictures in the world. You've been seeing a bunch of them over the course of today, but you can't actually experience it. And Egypt is its major importance, you might say, is it's not that it was necessarily the highest level of civilization ever achieved by human beings, but it is the highest level of civilization that we can still access in depth and come back with it viscerally in our emotional centers and in our gut. And nowhere else on earth can you do this. You can go to the great Gothic cathedrals, which is supreme, superb, sacred art, and you can go to the great mosques and the temples of India and the wonderful things in South America. But nowhere is there this onslaught of sacred art and architecture, and day after day after day, it's like, as a bad analogy, it's like listening to all of Beethoven, all of Bach, and all of Mozart, not necessarily simultaneously, but in sequence through very good speakers. After 14 days of Egypt, and of course, if you don't get it, if you don't see it through symbolist eyes, I'll get into that momentarily. If you don't see it through symbolist eyes, you really don't see it at all. And the peculiar thing is that symbolist Egypt, that's the interpretation, the life work of the great French, actually Alsatian philosopher, mathematician, Pythagorean, Orientalist, with the unpronounceable name R.A. Schwaller de Lubix. If he had been called Joe Dokes or Bill Smith, everyone would have heard about him, but nobody can pronounce, or almost nobody can pronounce, and he could pronounce René Schwaller de Lubix and get away with it, but the rest of us can't. So this is why nobody knows about him, because they're ashamed to mispronounce his name. Anyhow, so with Egypt, there are only a handful of people who understand Schwaller's work. It's quite impenetrable, well enough to retransmit it. And I happen to be the only one who leads symbolist tours. So either you go with me or you don't get symbolist Egypt. Simple as that. And I have a trip going. I do them continually. I do 3 or 4 a year, nowadays with everybody scared stiff to go, because the prostitutes of the media have scared everybody off and made it sound as though it's Syria, whereas in reality it's probably a lot less dangerous than Los Angeles. It's certainly less dangerous than Chicago. And, but people are scared, and no trip goes by without people asking, is it safe? And like anything, everything is safe until it isn't. And if you break it down, I mean, if you try to look at it rationally, and fear is not a rational emotion, if you try to look at it rationally and just say, well, just how dangerous is it? Even if something happens while we're there, the chances of you or me being caught up in it are about the same as being struck by lightning. Those are the chances. In fact, I've been in Egypt. In the 90s, they were gunning for tourists. Now they're not gunning for tourists. Well, there are hardly any tourists there to gun for, which is a big advantage when you're going there. And I did recently, because I have to address this all the time. Recently, I did another, for a trip that's coming up in December, another kind of update on is it safe or isn't it safe. And I did a little bit of research. I live in the upstate New York in Ulster County. And I often use the image of how many times have you driven down the road and there's a smoking wreck and the ambulances are screaming and you see that this was some terrible accident and you see that it only happened about 10 minutes ago. So what do? You look at it and say, 10 minutes, it's a good thing I'm coming now. 10 minutes earlier, that could have been me, but it wasn't you. So you drive on without giving it a second thought. Then I chased it down. Ulster County, relatively tame county, rather more, let's say, culturally oriented than some county in Utah, but nevertheless, average sort of county. And over the course of a year, on average, 1,400 people die in automobile accidents. That's a lot of dead people. Does it stop anybody from driving? No. So you just don't think about going to Egypt. I mean, you don't take that into consideration. That's an element of danger. That said, the next trip is coming up very soon, but if everybody has, or anybody has the money and the will, it leaves on it leaves October 21st, and anybody interested, go to my website or corner me here because I'm available in public as long as the conference goes on, and we'll discuss it. Now, to get started, some thoughts on what we've been listening to most of the day. Many people have hit upon particularly pattern and number and geometry and the cosmological significance of the constants, as it were, of these elements within the cosmic scheme, and the absolute certainty that the ancients knew about these elegant, and sophisticated geometrical, numerological relationships. But my big question, and it's always been a big question, is a practical one. What did they expect to accomplish? You can sort of ballpark it and say, well, they are in some way, shape, or form connecting humanity at large, connecting the particular society or civilization that is employing these complex cosmological constants in their architecture, but what are they getting from it? And the answer is, at the moment, at any rate, we don't know. And it would be very interesting. I would be fascinated, and it's not something that I'm about to do, because I don't have that level of geometrical, cosmological expertise at my fingertips. It would be really interesting if we had some sort of inkling of the practical aspects of doing that, because we now know enough about it. Just the knowledge that has been passed around by Alan and by who was just on, Scott, and a few of the other people. There's a lot of knowledge that we now have, that a number of people have it. How could we, or how would we, or how can we redeploy that kind of knowledge into our own society in such a way that it actually makes a difference, because what we have now, and this is another thing, going back to Egypt, you will forgive me if I digress, or you won't forgive me, I don't care, I'm going to digress anyhow, because I can't do anything else. The important thing, one of the important things that comes through when we go to Egypt is that at the end of the 2 weeks, you really understand not just what a civilization consisted of, a true civilization that lasted, even in its dynastic form, 3,500 years, but you understand the contrast between it and what we call civilization. Well, we actually call it progress, which I call shiny barbarism, and they're almost diametric opposites. If I babble on long enough, we'll see. Maybe I'll get into the 5 cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0, and maybe the Jesuits of the Church of Progress, who are science, education, and the press. Maybe. We'll see if I get into that. Big surprise. And anyhow, so this is one of the most important messages, or let's say learning experience, that comes out of Egypt. The heady, ecstatic experience of living with sacred art and architecture at that level for that long, and the intellectual understanding of the difference between them and us. And there is seriously a very big difference indeed. So that said, there was something else I was about to get into, and I just forgot it, but let's see if it comes back. What I want to go through, shock, one of the other things I like about going last is that I don't have to repeat stuff. I can cut out from what I was going to talk about in the first place, and so in certain cases implement what others have spoken about. So in this case, what I want to do is show you first, I'll just zip through, because Shock has done a lot of this, but I have a number of pieces of pictorial slides of Egypt that don't illustrate certain of the points that Shock has made very, very perfectly adequately, but the pictures implement it, and then I have some funny stories to tell around them. So let's see what comes up next. Wait, whoops. This is just, why is this not happening? See, this is, wait, why is this not going on? Help, Scott. Help, what am I doing? I screwed up something already. Technology and I don't get on. It's showing 0. You said you were going to be here. What am I doing wrong? Uh-oh, see, I sabotaged the machine. I didn't touch the machine. And already it's gone. Now he brought it back. Okay, now which one do I press? This, right?
That's one.
I pressed that.
Try,
okay,
yeah.
See? It's after me. It hates me. Really. Anyway, this is just a wonderful, particularly good black and white infrared picture of the Sphinx in all of its regal splendor. The next one is why the Great Sphinx cannot have been weathered by wind and sand, because there it is in the 20th century, early 20th century, and this is what happens if you don't scoop out the sand and keep it scooped out. Within 15 or 20 years, it builds back up. Here, left another 10, 15 years, the sand would have built up so that all you would see is just the head above the level of the sand. So what this means from a scholarly point of view and a scientific point of view is if the academics, who I call quackademics, were insistent upon saying that it's been weathered by wind and sand, and many of them still do, you can prove, actually, through the text that the Sphinx has been covered up to the neck in sand for about at least 3,000 of the 15, of the 30, of the 4,500 years that have elapsed since it's been constructed. And it's self-evident to all but a few that once it's covered up with sand, it can't weather. So that leaves, and the weathering, as we will see, is very, very extreme. One of the projects Jacques and I have paramount in our minds is getting over there with a panel of geologists with varying specialties, various forms of expertise that are relevant to actually putting a date on the Sphinx, because so far we can't do it. All that Jacques was saying up to now is speculation, and all that I will be saying right now is more speculation, and we'll show you why that's consequential. The other things, of course, we talked about it being the Sphinx as being supposedly the face of Khafra, the builder of the builder of the second pyramid. So we continue. This is the face, supposedly, this is the face of the Sphinx in its recarved form. And you see in profile that it looks very definitely African and sub-Saharan African. It has been recarved. What does this mean? What was it before? We don't know. And until or unless they invent some kind of technological Curlian photography that can film and capture the picture of what it was before it was recarved, we'll never know. So it might have been the same face, but just got so weathered that they had to recarve it. Or it might have been a lion, fully, wholly, the body of a lion. It might have been a queen, could have been female, nobody really knows. Anyway, and the next one, here's the face of Khafra, and just keep those in your head for a second. Okay? Okay, there's the head of Khafra, and you see with the falcon assimilated into the consciousness of the pharaoh. This is to implement, in fact, what Jacques was talking about the bird head, the bird man, and so on. Horus is the bird that represents the return to the source. For reasons, all of the animals and the insects and everything used in Egyptian symbology has a cosmic and a spiritual and an esoteric side to it. So in this case, the Horus falcon is assimilated into the head of the pharaoh. And the message that comes through, and it's a brilliant message because when we're there in the museum, and I'm not sure if I even have it on my slides, but when you approach this total masterful statue, whoops, no, that's not what I want, damn it. I'm telling you, it hates me. Okay, here we go. You see how Horus represents the return to the source, the return to the light. And so here you have the falcon, the Horus falcon, assimilated into the head of the consciousness of the pharaoh, and with his wings spread down here. Now, if you come at this statue from the front, the way you would approach it, you don't actually see the falcon there. You have to go around the side to see that there's a falcon. And what the message is, the unspoken message is, that the divinized or enlightened man or woman doesn't look any different from anyone else. It's only when you go around to the side that you see the falcon of enlightenment is there. So this is an important lesson, and we see lots of those kinds of lessons in Egypt. Now we get into, originally, this is why I need lots of time, the idea was once we just got some money together and decided to go over and make a film of our work, one of the things that we had to counter was that in the 80s, well, since the early 20th century, the Sphinx it's been believed that the face of the Sphinx represents the face of Khafra. We just saw the face of Khafra in that great statue, And here, so what I originally wanted to do, we were making a video, and the loyal opposition in the form of Mark Lehner and a couple of the other guys, but Mark especially, in the middle 80s, he did a kind of an early computer study. It wasn't very sophisticated because the computers weren't that sophisticated, but he did a computer study of, he kind of took the measures, or he took the actual, the Khafra head that's in the museum, the one that we just saw, and then he plunked it on top of the body of the Sphinx and said, aha, it looks like Khafra after all. Well, this is not very sound science, but this got a lot of press. New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, National Geographic, all of these things. Normally, I wouldn't have felt it necessary to repudiate that connection. But because it was so well known, we felt we had to do something. So I had the idea of using exactly that same technique, but plunking down the head of Elvis on top of the Sphinx and proving that the Sphinx was really Elvis. Everybody was in favor of this idea, except the Elvis Foundation. There is such a thing. They wouldn't let us use Elvis's figure. Elvis would be turning over in his grave. He loved to be the Sphinx. So next best, immediately my partner in this came up with the idea of bringing in a forensic artist to do comparative studies of the head, which is, the Elvis connection is a great joke, but it isn't exactly science. But getting a forensic artist to compare the heads is. So no time flat, we had Frank Domingo was the senior forensic detective for the NYPD to come and do these studies, which took a long time. You'd think they look simple. There were weeks of days of standing on trucks to get exactly the right angle so he could get the things together. And here you see what's obvious to anybody looking at the statue of Khafra, that these two figures are completely different, even though even though the face has been severely disfigured of the Sphinx itself, you have these reference points, these angles, which are drastically different in the actual statue of Khafra. Domingo's conclusion was that under no circumstances whatsoever could competent sculptors create the Sphinx and the Khafra image out of the same human being. And my criminal partner, who without him the whole thing never would have happened, but he stole $150,000 from the till so we could never carry on our work. Anyway, that's another long story, not for now. And he had a really great line when he got this news from Frank Domingo. He said, boy, this is, for the academics, this is bad news and worse news. The bad news is that there was an Atlantis, and the worst news is that they were black. And an interesting sidelight to that is that after we had Frank Domingo's work, I forget when it was exactly, 93 was the video, 95, no, even earlier, it's late 80s, somewhere along the line. I had an op-ed piece to do for the New York Times, and I carefully left out that sub-Saharan African connection because the Egyptians are as prejudiced as everyone else, and the last thing they want to know is that the Sphinx comes from deep into the middle of Africa. So I left that out. But about 3 weeks later, the Times printed a letter from an orthodontist, a Massachusetts orthodontist. It's another kind of expert in physiognomy, an expert in faces, who said, hey, didn't anybody notice that the Sphinx is a sub-Saharan African? So it's not me saying it anymore, it's somebody else. Anyway, so let us continue. Okay, now this is the depth of the weathering. This is a close-up of the extent of the weathering. And here's a little anecdote that Chuck didn't tell, but now it's okay to tell. He swore me to secrecy, which is a bad thing to do anyhow, when we first started out. But when we finally scraped together a few dollars to get over to Egypt for our preliminary investigation, and Chuck was, as cautious as anybody could possibly be. I mean, the week that we were there, we couldn't get a declarative sentence out of him, but he was looking. But his reaction when he walked into the enclosure, this is the weathering. This is the weathering on the side wall of the Sphinx, and when we walked into the enclosure, everybody else does a gasp when you're in the presence of this spectacular work of sculpture, arguably the best on the face of the planet. But Chuck, the geologist, and he saw the rocks, and he said, "Wow, these rocks look like they're hundreds of thousands of years old." And then he said, "Don't quote me on that." So I haven't until lately, but now he's out of the closet, so I can do it. Anyway, this gives you an idea. This gives you a graphic idea of the kind of weathering, what's involved here, and this is why we're so anxious to get over there. Whether or not we can actually date it, we don't know. But it could even be, my sense of it is, and the Egyptians themselves talk about in the texts, as well as a stone stela called the Palermo stone, and a very ruinous but reconstructed papyrus called the Turin papyrus, because that's where these are lodged, not that they have anything to do with Palermo and Torino, respectively, that where the Egyptians themselves are talking about long reigns when they have god kings, the Necheru themselves, which I take to mean human beings who are fully exalted and fully divinized. And they give the names of the kings and their regnal years. And then another long list of semi-divine rulers called the Shemsu Hor, which means the followers or the companions of Horus. And again, the names of the kings and their regnal years. And when you put that all together, you get about 34,000 years, 36,000 years, allowing for certain gaps and lacuna and so on. So this is the Egyptians themselves talking about their own history. But of course, today's quackademics have PhDs from somewhere or another, so they know more about ancient Egyptian history than the Egyptians themselves. But we don't necessarily have to accede to that conceit. And when Jacques was talking earlier about the dates, one of the striking things about the Sphinx is that it reeks of a Leo connection. And when the sun rises on the vernal equinox, the last time that the Sphinx looked at its own image in the sky was around 10,500, 11,000 BC or thereabouts. And this is a figure that Hancock and Beauval have zeroed in on. And originally, I thought maybe so too. But although when I developed the theory to start off with, in Serpent in the Sky, I had no geology to go with, and I couldn't find a geologist to talk with. So I went with the Egyptians themselves at 36,000 without connecting it, through archaeoastronomy. But given what the Egyptians themselves are telling us, the precessional age prior to 10,000 or thereabouts BC is, in fact, about 36,000 BC. So I'll go with that for the moment, but it occurs to me, given the depth of the weathering, and Jacques doesn't even necessarily disagree with it, but it could be even older than that. And some of the speakers today, over the course of the day, we're talking about the cycles going much, much further back than not recorded history stops at about 3,500 BC, but way, way back following the precessional cycles. Anyway, to continue. Okay, all of these are just examples of the weathering, and where we're walking there, you see you see that we're on a shelf here, a substantial shelf, and the original wall is weathered back from that. And when you look at some of the deeper weathering. Let's see, there we are, me standing in this deep, deep, deep crevice. When you're in there, you can see that it's hard to imagine. You never see weathering like this on the face of the planet. Certainly nothing that you would associate with a civilization. So anyway, now more bits and pieces, and I'm going to whip by some of these. This is the Khafra pyramid, second pyramid, and you see that it's built in stage, or anyway, that there are two very different styles of masonry here. There are these gigantic blocks, which are similar to the kind of construction around the temple of the Sphinx, and then piled on top is this much rougher core masonry, which we agree probably was put on there by Khafra. But whenever you see two radically different styles of masonry within the same structure, you know automatically that you're dealing with two different periods of construction. If you buy a nice Victorian house and it's got an IKEA kitchen in it, nice new shiny kitchen, do you say, "Phew, these were pretty advanced Victorians. Look at that, a dishwasher and a microwave. Wow." No, you say, somebody put an IKEA kitchen into this nice Victorian house. Anyway, everywhere but Egyptology does this prevail. That when there's two different styles of architecture, and no, they're all built by the same people. Here, you see, these are the paving blocks around the Khafra pyramid. This is one block. Wait, you see there? This is one block. That's one block. And that's the block seen edge on. So that block that I showed you is about 20 by 30 feet. They're 6 to 8 feet thick. And the question then becomes, even if this were dynastic Egyptian, how the devil did they do that? And then the question again, why did they do it? I mean, they have to have had some reason they were not showing off to anybody who could put down the biggest block with the smallest tolerance between the joints. No, they have to have had some reason or another. Those who think that the aliens built the pyramids, a position I do not have a lot of sympathy with, say that they could have been, that's why they needed landing pads for their spaceships. But the spaceships are pretty buoyant, you would think, having come from Mars or the Pleiades or whatever, and they wouldn't need this kind of structure to support their pyramids or their paving stones. But this brings me back again, as I said, I digress, but I get back to it, on the purpose of all of this extraordinary geometry, the geometric constants, the phi and the pi and the e, and all of these figures incorporated into their structures. They have to have had some probably intellectualized and articulate reason for doing this, or maybe not even articulated, but they knew it was very important to do it. And I mean, you do things for some purpose or another. And this is a major question. I mean, this is something that's a real consequence to us as we see, and I would take issue with one of our speakers today, that everything is really okay. I don't think it's okay at all. And it's going to hell in a handbasket in a big, big hurry. And it is very important for us individually and collectively, if we're going to get anything accomplished at all, to come to some kind of a coherent understanding of why they were doing what they were doing, and to see if in some way or another we can get into that kind of, it isn't even a mindset, it's a kind of heart set that would impel us to do the kinds of structures, or to reproduce, not reproduce, but to, in our own way, to do the kind of sacred art and sacred architecture that has the kinds of effect on us, and I'll get to this in a bit, that sacred art, real sacred art and architecture has. I don't know how many of you have been, say, to the Cathedral of Chartres. Many? Not so many. Or to Egypt, a few, right? Yeah, not so many. It's not until you go there, like sex, until you've experienced it, you don't really understand it. And of fitting things to fitting activities carried out for a specific purpose is you have to know what your purpose is, which always reminds me, I'm a student of the Gurdjieff work, and there's a story told about Gurdjieff. I don't know how many of you know about him, an extraordinary and controversial man, but there's a story about him told by one of his pupils. Gurdjieff was talking about the school that he had of seekers who were doing complex experiments in raising consciousness. And he told whoever this was that they even succeeded in making a sheep conscious. And the obvious question is, well, what did you do with it? And he said, we ate it. There's more to this than you think. It's not just a wise-ass answer. So I leave that with you because I can't explain it either. With Gurdjieff, you never know if he was pulling your leg or if he wasn't pulling your leg, but there's no point in making a sheep conscious. That's all you can do with eat it. You want to use higher consciousness for some other reason. Okay, that's more on holding rocks. This is the osier, and I'm going to zip by some of this stuff now. Another instance of earlier construction. A good friend of mine is about to publish inside, in the chambers in here, and on the other side, there are lots of inscriptions, and a good friend of mine, and they're astronomically based, and a good friend of mine has decoded them, proving that the Egyptians are very, in a very sophisticated fashion, painting or inscribing reliefs that have to do with reconciling the cycles of the sun and the cycles of the moon in precession. So this is all over Egypt, actually. A lot of the architecture, whatever the symbolism, whatever the obvious meaning of the symbolism or the apparent meaning of the symbolism, often it is astronomical, astrological, and it is doing something, but I'm not sure what. This is my question again of what is the intention behind all of that, not just all of that sacred science, but of manifesting it in this particular fashion. Anyway, this is Osirian, which is one of the most potent and one of the most resonant of Egyptian architecture. Now there's the Osirian again. It gets covered up with water now because the water table has risen, and you get a sense here, a sense of scale of the size of the blocks. It's mind-boggling. We continue now over to Göbekli Tepe. Shock covered that in excellent detail, but this is an artist's rendition of it early, and you get, of course, it's an artist's rendition, but you do get a sense of the uncluttered, when it's not a jumble as it is when they excavate it, of what the probably not too accurate, but you do get a sense of the overall picture, and of course it goes, whoops. And of course the whole, where's my picture? The whole thing goes, it covers up all over the rest of the hill, and there are some 20-odd of these stone structures, and I think Schock is probably almost certainly correct in seeing astronomical differences in astronomical orientations, that each one of these is illustrating one of those things, which brings us back to the same question. Stonehenge, here they are tossing around 40-ton blocks, carefully orienting them to certain solstitial and equinoctial points, but for what? They're getting something from this that we don't know. Okay, here's Göbekli Tepe. I can zip around that now. Schock covered all of that. Oh, this is a little one he didn't cover, but this is pretty intriguing. This is a little bead that was found in Göbekli Tepe. And you see, there's a little bead, that's somebody's hand. So this is a small bead, and it was presumably part of a necklace, and you're looking at the hole that's drilled in this very hard stone, which is, I think, a porphyry, and presumably there's a whole necklace full of such stones, and it makes you wonder, well, what are they drilling with? And okay, with some, hunter-gatherer who's been in an argument with his wife, and he says, gee, I better do something that gets her back on my side. So I said, I know what, got these hard little chunks of stone. I'll cut a hole through the stone and string them all together, and she'll be okay again. But see, but because a lot of these things, when you look at them, what is the motivation? Can you imagine how much work it was? However, I mean, we don't know how they did it. We don't know why they did it. And this is a big deal, this little bead. And then let's keep going, you see more. Now this is another hunter-gatherer one. This was found in Turkey recently. It's a bracelet made of obsidian, which is a practically impenetrable stone. And the archaeologists found that the ornament, not ornamentation, but the way that this is cut is very complex geometrically. So again, you've got this, hunter-gatherers, they just shot a rhinoceros and said, we've got food for a month or so. So what should we do now? They said, let's do something for the old lady. And so they cut this thing out of obsidian, and then one of them says, yeah, but it looks too regular. Let's invent geometry and decorate the stone. But this one is dated to 8,000 BC. So these are smart hunter-gatherers. And another thing on the subject of hunter-gatherers, there's a story about the American Indians that were talking about the settlers. Recently I read that there's never been a record of any Indian, Native American, wanting to learn Western culture. None. And then there's a story, and I'm not sure if it's a true story or someone just made up, of an Indian saying, before the white man came, our ladies, our women did all of the gardening and the plowing, and we went out and we hunted and we fished all day long. And now they're coming around telling us we should learn their ways and farm. We'd have to be crazy to want to do that. So this is a consideration. We automatically take hunter-gatherers as an inferior lifestyle to our own. And it isn't necessarily, they don't have, iPhones or anything of that sort, but maybe it wasn't so bad if all you had to do was go outside your tent or whatever, or your hut, wherever you were living, and shoot, with a bow and arrow, whatever happened to you walking by, and having food for a couple of months. This is not the worst way to live necessarily. And even on the esoteric side, even on the spiritual side, we are again assuming that sophistication requires literacy, technology, all of these things. But actually, for anybody here, probably you get this, maybe you haven't articulated it yourself, anybody involved in any kind of a genuine spiritual discipline, which doesn't mean a correspondence course in something, it means a practice. Without a practice, it isn't anything. But when you practice virtually anything, particularly anything having to do with movement, with dance or something like that, you could be in a constant state of, put it this way, a constant state of ecstasy if the only practice you had was dance. And we don't know where these people, what was the state of mind or the state of heart that they lived in as they were living all of these years. Oh, hunter-gatherers. No, maybe they were hunter-gatherers, but maybe they were a lot more advanced than we are, just as, for example, a living example, the shamans of the rainforest. They can't write, they can't read, but they could figure out ayahuasca, and not rationally. There are 90,000 plants in the rainforest. And these are two completely undistinguished looking plants that don't grow anywhere near each other. And in order to put them together, one fixes, I forget what chemical it is that it has in it, DMT maybe, I forget. And one is a poison, and the body would reject it instantly. And the other fixes it so that even though it's pretty violent, it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but it fixes it so that you take it and you have all of these extraordinary, for whatever, lack of a better word, spiritual experiences. Well, how did they invent? Who discovered ayahuasca, how to do it? I have some quotes actually in Serpent in the Sky of some guy saying, well, it must have been trial and error that did it. You have trial and error. Imagine you have 90,000 plants in the rainforest, so they go around, they collect 90,000 of them, and then they say, well, let's put this one with this one and this one with this one. No, they have to be able to observe emotionally, maybe not intellectually, even they have to observe emotionally the soul of that plant. If it's alive, it has a soul. The soul of that plant, and something tells them to put this one with this one, and then it has to go through a whole bunch of processes, has to be boiled to a certain way, and then reboiled, and then out comes this absolutely horrible tasting stuff that produces these extraordinary effects. So you don't need our sophistication, and you don't need, I would disagree with John Lundwall that writing is, and agree basically with Plato that writing is a step backward in a way. It deprives us of the need for our memory, and also words change. Putting things in writing is not a good way to keep them connected. Languages change enormously. And I mean, Shakespeare, anybody who says they can read Shakespeare just like that and understand all of it without a glossary there that says, well, by this, he means it's the same word we use, but the meaning is changed sometimes into its opposite. And you go further back, who the devil can read Chaucer at all? So the language changes, but the myths don't, because it doesn't matter what the language becomes. You can convey the myths, which, by the way, are not fanciful stories, as John was saying. They're not fanciful stories, but actually what they are, the true myths, and some of them come resonating down through the ages, the true myths are the dramatization of the interplay of cosmic principles. So you don't need to know the history, and you don't have to know how to read and write. The true myth connects viscerally to us, and we resonate to it, and the myth can be told and retold and retold, and with variations, but it will continue to resonate depending upon you might say, the brilliance of its reformulation. So Isis, Osiris, Horus, if you read the myth, is kind of tough to read, really. I mean, you don't react to it especially. Hamlet, we do react to. Hamlet is, by the way, a recreation or a retelling of the Isis, Osiris, Horus myth. A fact absolutely obvious that was missed by most of the drama critics. This is not surprising. And then recently, I don't know how many of you saw it, how many of you saw the movie, not the play, the movie of The Lion King? Lots of people see that? Yeah, lots of people saw that. Well, somebody, that's Isis, Osiris, and Horus again. It's the Hamlet story. And there are some interesting bits in there. I forget who the screenwriter was, but there's a point in there where the little lion cub is looking up at the sky and pointing to the stars, and he says to his father, the Lion King, "What are those?" And the Lion King says, "Those are the souls of dead kings." Well, that's not part of Hamlet. That's not in Hamlet. But it is part of the Egyptian pyramid texts. And as Jacques was talking about earlier, it's a stretch, perhaps. I mean, there's no point even bringing up such a subject to a quackademic. So you're better off just keeping your mouth shut. But it is worth considering that the soul, whatever the soul stuff is, it's very, very rarefied. And who are they to say that the universe just coagulates accidentally out of a lot of gas? They're mostly a lot of gas, but the universe knows what it's doing. So anyway, so the true myths resonate down through the ages and are a much better way of communicating real knowledge, because everybody will understand it on his or her own level. Nowadays, to understand cosmology, you have to be an astrophysicist, or, I mean, really a mathematically adept, which I certainly am not. But I can understand the Osiris-Horus myth at a very, let's say, at a very emotional, satisfactory level. So, okay, more ancient technology. This is, I'll go through quickly, but this is a perfect example. This is hollowed out. The walls of this very hard green schist vase are the width of, the thickness of the lip of that. Now the question, how the devil did they hollow it out? We don't know. And the explanations that have been given are pretty preposterous. And it's thought, we think actually, that it's just possible, Jacques was talking about this, that after this giant CME event, which I think is pretty well established, after that giant event, the whole planet went into, let's say, a civilization free fall. And so we're wondering, it's more sophisticated than you think, actually, because if you go to a museum, Cairo Museum, there's a little tray full of, a couple of casement windows full of pre-dynastic things. But some of those pre-dynastic things, this is one, are very, very sophisticated. And not too long ago, the Met put together, in New York, put together a Origins of Egyptian Art show. And there were certain things in it. A lot of it was fairly crude pottery and combs and little things like that. But some of it was elegantly realized, small but polished, beautiful sculptures. And so we wonder if maybe these are artifacts from that still earlier civilization, because it's sort of weird that they should be producing, they should be producing mostly just crudely thrown or relatively crudely thrown pots, and at the same time be producing these things that we wouldn't have a clue how to produce today. Okay, these are just more I'll zip through, but on the subject of hiding out from a CME or a next CME, these are in Sardinia, which is one of the best kept archaeological sites on the planet. Sardinia is full of these incredible structures called Nuraghi, which they date to around 2600 BC. But we think, I was shocking myself, that maybe they got them wrongly dated and they date from much, much earlier. Anyway, they're pretty amazing. That's the ceiling of one of them. That's a dome without any keystones or anything, just formed out of the rough rock. This is Nabta Playa, the stone circle in southwestern Egypt, which, even though it looks like a jumble, is in fact, it's demonstrably employing very sophisticated astronomical alignments, and they date it, not us, they date it to at least 6,000 or so BC. So 6,000 BC, they've already got their astronomy together, and it's already important enough for them to integrate it into their structures. Okay, that's another Nabta Playa. That's just a schematic of it. Now this is, they really shouldn't, we go back, Jacques was talking before, of dealing with the opposition and the notion of ancient, sophisticated civilization. This is the most recently discovered of the Paleolithic caves in France. It's called Cave of Chauvet. And What's different about it, the others with the really fabulous painting are Altamira and Lascaux with the Hall of the Bulls that everyone's probably familiar with. And these are dated to around 17 by stratigraphy and other means, stratigraphy to about 17 or 19,000 BC. So if they're hunter and gatherers at the 17, 19,000 BC, but they're painting like Picasso, you should, if you have your mind working a little bit correctly, say, hey, wait a minute. Primitive hunter-gatherers who paint like Picasso, and Picasso, in fact, learned from them, not necessarily a convincing connection. But here, this is Chauvet, and this one, the Quackademics, not me, the Quackademics, date this one to 31,000 BC or older. And this is by far the most sophisticated of all the cave art that they had. So again, the question arises, they're master painters. They may be wearing bearskins, and they may be whatever else they're doing, eating raw rhinoceros because they're too lazy to cook and they don't have a big enough oven. But this is fabulous art. And my contention is that great artists, I know some very good ones, and they're not primitives. Great artists are not primitive people. Let's look at these cave bears. There's the horses. I mean, this is wonderful stuff. And it's much more sophisticated than even these photographs suggest, because they use perspective and things go around corners. And why again, the question arises, what is it that they are trying to demonstrate? Usual explanation, oh, well, this is just hunting fetish stuff. They're painting all of this stuff on the walls so that they can go out and hunt and the animals will sort of fall down in front of them and they can just eat them. No, to me, that's not a good enough explanation. But what you have here, this is what I'm saying, though, that when you're dealing with the dates, and I mean, it's a nightmare story of getting the French archaeologists to accept that the Paleolithic caves are ancient caves. When they were first discovered, I think in the 1870s, Hancock has a big chapter, it's a really good chapter in one of his books, I guess it's Supernatural, on the battle to get the establishment, to get the Quackademic establishment to acknowledge that these are actually ancient, that these are actually artifacts of a very ancient civilization. And I mean, the people who were working on it committed suicide, a few of them, because they just couldn't handle the opposition that was so rabidly against them, because it was actually overthrowing their pet paradigm, which I will come to in my usual circuitous fashion shortly. So that's, whoops, oh, and here's the same one. That's Boris, my criminal partner, swinging the digital sledge that is going to reveal the chamber beneath the paws of the Sphinx. Now we're going to zip ahead. That one you saw already. That's the Sphinx. Now we get to symbolist Egypt. And what time is it? How much time do I have left? Oh, yeah? Is that a challenge? We will see about that. 5:15. What time am I supposed to be finished? 9 p.m. Okay. I can stick that. Hey, can somebody bring me, I forgot to, a thing of water? Where's Brian? Where's Sean? Sean around? Anybody? Some water? Zeke, are you there somewhere? Okay, so again, as briefly as possible, which is never very briefly. When Schwaller came to Egypt in 1937, he had been brought up, without even going into biography, but he was brought up, he was a practicing alchemist, Orientalist, mathematician. He'd been brought up in a scientific household. His father was a chemist. And early on, he was not a theosophist, but connected with theosophy. He was kind of a boy wonder. His first little pamphlet at age 16 was about Pythagorean mathematics. Anyway, I originally thought I couldn't find out much about him trying to research it, even though I worked extensively with his stepdaughter when I was writing Serpent in the Sky, which, by the way, is not for sale. Thank you. Thanks, Zach. What is that? Hold on. Yeah. Which, yeah, that's fine. Thanks. Which, which is not for sale on the bookshelf here because my stupid publisher sent the wrong book. So it's not my fault that you can't get it. That's why from now on I do self-publishing, among other reasons. Anyway, Schwaller was very interested, particularly in Western Hermeticism, and I originally thought that he went to Egypt in 1937 just on a holiday. He was very lucky that he had a wife who was both beautiful and rich. Good luck. And so he didn't have to work for a living. He could just be a full-time genius and get his work done. Actually, his wife helped a lot with his work. So he went to Egypt, but he was looking for the basis of the Hermetic disciplines, which from time immemorial, from the Platonists, the Neoplatonists on, through the Renaissance, the sages of the Renaissance, all of them believed that their knowledge derived from Egypt. All of them. But once so-called rationalist science, materialist science took over, it became a kind of heresy to acknowledge that the Egyptians actually had a very sophisticated civilization. We'll get into this in a bit too. So Schwaller went, and what he was looking for specifically was the use, and when he went into the temple of Luxor here, this is an aerial view, as you see, and here's the temple, and you see it's totally ruinous, but even there you get a sense that it's built. You see, this is all skewed off to the side here, and that it's actually built on several axes. And Schwaller, going through this temple, and believe me, when you're in on the ground level, it's quite fantastic. I mean, it's an enormous temple, but Schwaller had this, let's say mystics call a revelation, and artists call an inspiration, and scientists call a hypothesis formation in order to make it sound as boring as possible. So Schwaller had such a hypothesis formation, which was that this whole temple was an exercise in harmony and proportion. The temple is built around 1300 BC. Harmony and proportion are supposedly inventions of Pythagoras, or anyway, certain of the Greeks about 1,000 years later. And so Schwaller put his anchors down and decided to stay in Egypt and to see if he could show that this extraordinary double axis structure was incorporated harmony and proportion. And he was incredibly lucky in that the French mission there at the time was surveying the temple to the millimeter, so he had exact measurements to work with, and he very swiftly proved to his own satisfaction, and anybody else's, in fact, who cared to look at it, that it did indeed incorporate harmony and proportion, the Fibonacci series, in fact, the diatonic scale as well. And then it occurred to him, let's see if the next one. Yeah, there you have the different harmonies and proportions written into the, correlated to the, particularly the whoops, incorporated into the, particularly the articulations of the main structures of the main parts of the temple that they corresponded. He came across to the idea that this represented, that's why he called it the Temple of Man, because the whole thing as a schematic is done to the precise proportions of the average male skeleton. We think I think anyway, that there's a corresponding temple of woman up in Philae, and because women have a different, the golden section cuts at a different point, and our proportions are considerably different. But anyway, he took this. I mean, he took this idea and ran with it, and the mathematics led him to the astronomy, and the astronomy to the symbolism, and the symbolism to the medicine, and all of the other aspects of Egypt. So he stayed parked there through World War II, and in 1952 he could see trouble brewing and Nasser coming in and so on, and he decided to leave Egypt and go back to France. But in the process, he reformulated, he put together his symbolist interpretation, which concentrated upon Egypt, of course, focused upon Egypt, is actually a reformulation of the sacred science of the ancients. And in my view, probably the single most important work of scholarship in the last 2,000 years, because it really does demonstrate, for those willing to follow the evidence, that the extent of the knowledge that they had, and Schaller opened the door for lots of others among us who can take his work and find not necessarily faults in it at all, but places where there's lots more study to be done. So we're in the process, we think, of turning all of history around, and I will be getting to this shortly, and I want to get through this part first. So there we have the play of geometry that defines the various aspects of the temple. And now we get to what is it that makes sacred art sacred. And it's not just that it's called the Church of so-and-so. When you're in the middle of, if you go to a Methodist chapel in Wales, you'll see what sacred art isn't, because God doesn't like it there. Or your neighborhood megachurch either. God runs away from there and goes to see a football game. In the 19th century, there was a Swiss early physicist. There was hardly physics at that time, but he was particularly interested in the phenomena of acoustics, and he got very intrigued in the relationship between, or the possible relationship between frequency and form. So his name was Ernst Kolodny, and what he did was he fastened a metal plate to a violin and sprinkled sand on the plate. I don't know where he got this idea from, actually, because it's not an obvious idea that one would come up with. He sprinkled sand on the plate and bowed the violin and got these remarkable harmonic geometric figures that look rather like mandalas. Well, in fact, they look like mandalas. Here's one. And this is just photograph. This is just a photograph of sand sprinkled on a plate and photographed. And then they're called Kolodny figures, and they've been, let's say, curiosities for 100 and some odd years. And then in the 40s and 50s, I think that's when it was, anyway, around then, another Swiss artist, anthroposophist, follower of Rudolf Steiner, and scientist as well, decided to do deeper study into the Kolodny figures, and he devised rather simple devices that would allow him to vibrate different materials but at controlled vibrations. And the next few minutes now, we'll see he called this study cymatics, from the Greek kymos, which means wave. So in other words, it's a study of wave forms, frequencies. And I don't have the sound, because I took the clips from the video, but it wouldn't matter even if there were sound. It's only it's not as though they're playing Beethoven. It's just a ups and downs of sound. But what you're going to see now is a few minutes, which is good because I need a break, of a few minutes of different materials being vibrated on different mediums. Some of it are powders on a plate. At the end, there are metal filings on a steel plate, which is really amazing. I can do a bit of commentary as we're going along. But what we're actually seeing is something really of immense importance. And Kolodny knew, Hans Jenny, I didn't even give his name, Hans Jenny knew exactly what he was showing. And on the original video, it's a very dry commentary because he absolutely didn't want to upset his scientific colleagues. And there's a video called Kymatics, it's kind of visually not very technologically brilliant. And if you Google up cymatics now, there are lots of people who are doing their own experiments on cymatics and coming up with all kinds of really interesting stuff. And this is material that should be taught in every, at least at the 9th, 10th, 11th grade, any high school in the country, because what it's demonstrating, if I say it's the relationship of frequency and form, it doesn't sound as though there's anything emotional behind it. But it is actually a demonstration of the famous "in the beginning was the Word," and of the Word, in other words, that out of vibration comes manifestation. And manifestation is the visible and the experiential world that we all live in. And here you see its basis, and it's really moving, and you can see why the various schools, colleges, ordinary education, the John definition of education, Western education, that it is to the mind what AIDS is to the immune system. The more experience, the more exposure you have to it, the more likely it is to be lethal. So you can see why normal schools would be afraid of this stuff, because it actually has some meaning and the kids might get interested. So, okay, here it is now. It's supposed to start. It is. Now this is on a steel plate, and just watch and I think these are powders, lycopodium powder or something. And this is all, there's just a shifting of sound waves, and this is what's happening. More, come on, there we go. These are the forms that come from. Where does the backbone come from? Ah, well. Yes. Yeah. And these are just clips from it. The actual video is about 45 minutes. Trilobites, anyone? All of this is just vibration and different powders and sands and so on. Dragonflies. That starts out just as chaos of powder on a plate. And he has other things where he's photographing, vowels, for example, A, E, I, O, U, and getting different forms out of the, out of the chaotic material. Now here, this is my favorite. These are steel filings or iron filings on a metal plate, and it's just vibration. It looks like a martial art film by Kurosawa. Look at that. And that's metal form. Why do they associate Mars with metal, with iron? Look at it. Yeah. Oh, it would be not a steady tone. It would be changing, I think. Anyway, that's it. They lost the war, by the way, but nevertheless, the demonstration is impressive. So that's, in other words, to get back to the original, you see, I do get there. Where I left off from was why is the sacred sacred? And from the harmonies and the proportions, Goethe called architecture frozen music, which is not just metaphorically and poetically true, it's literally true. And this is why when you go into a Hathor temple, it's one thing, and you go into an Ammon temple, it's quite another, and a Horus temple is something else again. They, the architects and the keepers of sacred geometry, understood that the so-called gods are not these primitive figures invented by simple-minded peasants or simple-minded aggrandizing priests, but rather that the so-called gods, as soon as you call the gods not gods, but cosmic principles, the whole thing changes. And as I said earlier, myth is the articulation or the embodiment. Myth tells in dramatic form the interaction of cosmic principles. And in architecture, it's doing the same sort of thing. All of the so-called gods are associated with certain numbers and certain number combinations, which are in turn associated with certain ratios and geometrical forms. And when those are put together by somebody who really knows what he's doing, out comes these amazing temples. And Egypt goes, it's very strange, this gets into procession in various ways, and I'm not exactly sure how, but it's at its height, very close to its beginning, and then gradually, presumably as it descends, as the cycle continues, and it gets closer and closer to the Dark Age, to the Kali Yuga, it gets heavier and less exalted looking. Geometry is still intact, but it gets much less emotionally involved, but it's there. And when you go there, as I said, it particularly applies to Egypt, less so to other cultures, to a very considerable extent to Indian architecture, but that's much later. There's nothing that goes back to 3000 BC or 2000 BC in India, but the geometry is the same. 5 hours? Okay. Really? Oh, all right. You go to the Gothic cathedrals, the great ones, and only the real Gothic, the 12th and 13th century are Gothic, and then it gets high Gothic, and it all gets degenerate and it gets overly fussy, and it loses its purity. But it's only in Egypt that you have sacred architecture that embodies the entirety of this great esoteric discipline. Now, you warned me there 5 minutes, and now this is not wait a sec. So anyway, what we're looking at here, what we will be looking at momentarily, all of this is all symbolist Egypt, and all of these figures to try and get a sense of. It won't make sense to us. A lot of it doesn't make sense to me, even with all the study I put in. But because symbolism is a dead art, and symbolism almost dead. We don't have sacred symbolism anymore, but we do have a form of secular symbolism that is good enough to allow us to understand what's going into these kinds of reliefs. And it is that the political cartoon, but you have to be an initiated into the politics. In other words, a political cartoon in the New York Times or something else American is not going to be understood by a tribesman in the middle of Papua New Guinea or or in the Amazon, you have to be educated into the cartoon, but as long as you have some knowledge of it, you'll get the point. So you'll have Uncle Sam, America as Uncle Sam, in England by just John Bull, and La Liberté, France as La Liberté, and Russia the Russian bear all cut up into pieces like Osiris in a certain configuration. And out of that, you instantly get a very complex picture of a particular situation. Well, that's Egyptian symbolism, is like that. This is an incredibly complex thing. To us, doesn't make any sense at all. And if I go through it one thing by thing, I can say this is this and this is that and so on, but you still won't get an emotional hit out of it. An Egyptian priest would walk in and instantly get the whole thing in its totality. But now I really have to rush because I thought they were kidding before when they told me this amount of thing. This is the so-called cathode ray tube at the bottom of one of the crypts, which is not a cathode ray tube. It is cosmological, and it is the first. Sorry. Wait, damn it. Whoops. No, come on. I did something. Sean, help. What did I do? Can I go backwards now? Okay, wait a second. Okay, without going into a long palaver, this is in a deep crypt out of the bowels of the earth. The deep crypts are always where the beginnings of the universe. And what this is a representation of is the water snake represents vibration or energy. It's the primeval, where is it? It's the primeval, the first energy form. And it's springing from a lotus, which represents in Egypt sort of what it does in India. It's a plant that grows with its roots in the mud. It grows through the water. It flowers in the air. It sends out its mildly psychedelic perfume into the atmosphere, so it represents the four elements. And so this is at a principial level, not as a, in real life it does, but here we're talking symbology. And the sort of eggplant shape around the serpent is not a cathode ray tube, but if you're a cartoonist, and I was talking about cartoons, and you had to portray a smell, how would you do it? Something like this. And then this is stage one of the creation, and then the next stage shows two of these eggplant forms and a different snake. And then if you look carefully, you see that one snake is completely unfinished, and the next one, this one here, has its scales on, and you follow it through, and you see that it's stage one and stage two of universal creation. Anyway, more things as we go through. All of this is cosmology. The serpent, the crocodile this represents the axis of the universe, the upright hippopotamus representing maternity or creation, the principle of maternity or creation, the crocodile on its back representing death for fairly obvious reasons. And so all of these things make sense, make a visceral sense to the priests who are officiating. The public can't go into these places. This is in the tomb of Seti I. They can't go into these places because they wouldn't understand it anyhow. It's sort of like, Major League Baseball. It's democracy. Why can't I play center field for the Yankees or whatever? Well, I haven't paid my dues. That's why. And so with these places, this is cosmology again, going through. This is the sun's rays shining on the temple of Hathor. Well, I'm going to have to run because I thought I could babble on forever, and they're not going to let me. This is proof, according to Schwaller, the ram-headed sphinxes outside Karnak, because this is the period, the age of Taurus, ingressing into the age of Aries, and appropriately mirrored by the symbolism of ram-headed sphinxes, which didn't occur before. Here we go, Ankh and Waset symbol. I'm going to get, and this is the very important one. This is Isis and Osiris. This is Osiris, who's been killed by his brother Set, his wicked brother Set. And he's been cut into pieces, but he's been reassembled by his wife and sister Isis. The only thing that is missing is his phallus, which has been thrown into the river and eaten by a fish. And she charms a golden phallus from a god called Sokar that is good for just one night. And upon that phallus, Isis impregnates herself and will give birth to Horus, who represents the return to the source. So this is basic Christianity, but shown as Egyptian symbolism. Okay, more. There's Isis impregnating herself. This is actually the Immaculate Conception in 1300 BC. Okay, more things. This is Sekhmet, everybody's favorite goddess. Anyway, and all the ladies' favorite goddess, who represents esoterically the fire aspect of the female principle. It is she who is in charge of basically of war and destruction and of healing, but healing through purgation. There's another, just a gorgeous Sekhmet. This is Hathor, who represents cosmic femininity, and you see her face. This has been a big mystery until one of the women on my trip solved it. She's associated with birth and music and sexuality and so on. And sometimes she's shown as a cow or associated with the cow, and she has these strange cow ears. And one of the women on my trip, I was saying, this is such an un-Egyptian looking face. And she's shown in full face, which is very, very unusual in Egypt. And one of the women on my trip said, oh, well, John, it makes sense. Her face is in the shape of a uterus. And the ears are ovaries. And I checked this through, and it's absolutely correct. And even the quackademics are now beginning to acknowledge it. And sometimes inside, hidden in the ear, not in this one, actually, but you'll see a little egg in the inside of the ears. So they know all this stuff. They knew how to sculpt women. This is Horus. I was talking about him before. This is a very complicated and very interesting stela, and anybody who comes to Egypt with me will have it explained in depth. But now now we're running out of time, so can't be helped. That's deep down in that crypt. Where the beginnings of the universe. This is Saqqara, the rearing serpents on the wall representing the risen Kundalini. All of these things resonate with all of the other esoteric civilizations that ever were. This is Set, the bad guy, who is nevertheless a great god. And they often call him the god of evil. There is no god of evil, unless maybe it's Dick Cheney. There's a principle of opposition. He who refuses to return to the light, suddenly recognizes that. It puts a whole, if you really study mythology and you start getting a sense of it, you see that it makes immediate practical sense. Set is he who obstructs. When I turn my computer on in the morning, Set is there dissuading me from getting anything written. But I know this, so I don't have to fall under his spell, even though I do very often. Okay, now we're going. Okay, this is the weighing of the heart. All of this, there's my favorite. I have a thing about dogs. They're the Egyptian greyhounds pulling down the animals of the desert. The animals of the desert, the untamed, the undomesticated, are all the domain of Set. And the greyhounds, there they are we there? The greyhounds are pulling them down, and interestingly enough, there's another very good rendition of those strange dogs, and here they are in real life, because they stayed pure on the island of Ibiza and Mallorca, where I lived on for many, many years, and took those dogs off with me. It was one of the first people to do, and I usually have a dog. At the moment I haven't. The last one, not even very old, died, and They're a lot of trouble, so I don't have one at the moment. Okay, here we go. The scarab beetle represents the principle of transformation. All of this, to explain this satisfactorily, this one I could do, would be 15, 20 minutes to explain that satisfactorily. And here we go. Okay, now quick run through of symbolist Egypt. From beginning, the Sphinx, and you'll see it sort of decrease. You'll see it lose its, not exactly lose its divinity, but you'll see it, what's the word I'm looking for? Degenerate in front of your eyes. Though through New Kingdom Egypt, this is Old Kingdom, well, it's not, it's much, much older, but Old Kingdom is 2500 BC to about 1000 BC. And it's wonderful right through that. And then it gets very decadent. Decadent is the word I'm looking for. So here's our Sphinx. Here's Saqqara, which is supposedly older than the Sphinx, but it might be, actually. Here's Saqqara reconstructed. This is what it would have looked like if you could go to it today and it were intact. This does not look like the first stone structure ever done, though until Göbekli Tepe was found, this was called the first major stone construction on the face of the planet. This does not look like somebody just sat down and said, well, let's build a temple. No, it has to have been the result of a long tradition of architectural knowledge. Here you see this is Old Kingdom, the inlaid eyes that look back at you. They stopped doing this in the New Kingdom or by the New Kingdom, and nobody has ever done it since. Very hard to do that. It's 4 different kinds of quartz crystal, and you have to know the reflective and the refractive indexes of the eye to produce an eye that looks back at you like this. So once you've seen the Egyptian, once you've been there, and you see in the museum these wonderful statues with their inlaid eyes, everything else, even Michelangelo's and everybody else, Rodin's, all of that statuary, it all looks blind. And it is, because it doesn't have inlaid eyes. Now we go, this is Hatshepsut's great temple, another one that looks like it's been built the day before yesterday. There's that wonderful, this face of Hatshepsut. Again, see how we're going. This is Abu Simbel, Ramesses II, about 1300 or so BC. And you really don't get a sense of scale there, but now you do. And pretty impressive. And this now, we're fast forward 1,000 years, and this is Ptolemaic art. These are Napoleon's drawings. And you see that it's all got heavy and clumsy looking. This is how clumsy and decadent the art has become. And now we're going further and further. And now it's into Roman times, and this is in the Museum of Alexandria, the so-called Ba bird, the bird of the soul. Here it is 1,000 years earlier on a papyrus, looking pretty refined and potent. More decadent stuff here. This guy looks like he just came back from the orgy, or some of my friends last night maybe, and probably did just come back from the orgy. There's the Sphinx reduced to Tony the Tiger, and things are getting worse and worse, and this is the last gasp of real Egyptian civilization in the catacombs of Komal-Jugafa in Alexandria, where everything has got jumbled up, and really it's lost all of its purity. The tombs are erected not by the temple itself, but by some wealthy family who is still practicing the ancient religion. And as you see, everything is corrupted. It's kind of, when you go into it, we don't go to Alexandria mostly. It's an extra day, and it's not worth going there just for this, and there's nothing much else. It's sort of an underground Disneyland. And the degeneration continues. Here are the gods of Egypt on the back of a camel. You can't get much lower than that. Christianity takes over, and here's I think this is the Byzantine cross, hammered into the columns of the temple of Philae, which was the last place to practice the Egyptian religion. And originally, the Copts who took over are really a continuation of Christianity without the science. And they were taking over the particular sacred parts of the temple and turning them into churches. They were not yet destroying everything. It took a while for them to perfect the art of destroying everything. Here we are again. These are stylized ankhs, all of a sudden looking like angels. And what do we have here? Now we're back to our Sphinx. And this brings on a new era. You know, everybody knows here, I'm sure everybody knows, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, correct? What are they? War, famine, pestilence, and death, which when you stop to think about it is actually a peculiar choice. The only horseman that we can do anything about, pretty much, is war. In theory, we can not have wars. In practice, we don't do that well with it. But pestilence, famine and pestilence are, brought on by nature mostly, and death comes to us all, so it's rather strange. But I talked a little bit about now I'm running out of time. I talked a little bit about the Church of Progress, which is our present religion, except it's not called progress. It is not called a church, it is called reason. And actually it's not reason, it is the rationalization. The whole materialist, Darwinist philosophy, if you can call it a philosophy, it's called the result of science, or let's say it's what science tells us we must believe or not believe, because in theory, they say that science leads us to that conclusion, the only conclusion possible by their standards. But really, and we don't have time to go into this, unfortunately, but it isn't reason at all. It is the rationalization of their own inner emptiness, and it is the Church of Progress is the religion of the emotionally retarded, spiritually dyslexic, and philosophically depraved. It has absolutely nothing to do with science itself. And in fact, the top scientists at the Max Planck, Einstein kind of level understand this, but the rest of the dumbheads don't. And it is they who actually control the press and control our educational system and so on. And I mean, the martial arts master I used to know would tell me that you do not teach, and it's impossible to talk to them. It's impossible to, let's say, have a reasonable conversation with these people because, as I said, martial arts master I used to know said, if you want to be happy in the world that we live in, you do not talk about moonbeams to the blind or music to the deaf, and you absolutely do not talk about sex to eunuchs because they just get angry and sometimes violent. And extending that metaphor, nobody is surprised when the eunuchs snigger behind the Sultan's back and deride his passions. But when they take over the palace and call their terrible disability reason, the empire is doomed. And this is where, basically, the position we're in now. I must say I'm rather less optimistic than a couple of our speakers here. The Church of Progress, its Jesuits are science, education, and the press. Science creates the dogma. Education inculcates it into helpless little kids. And the press, the media, try to make it palatable to people who otherwise might not find it palatable. They have their, like the mafia, they have their posse out there. These are the five, this is a John original, they have the five cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0. And they are, I don't have time to get into it, if people want to argue, go ahead. They are capitalism, patriotism, democracy, technology, and entertainment. Very briefly, capitalism is based upon the philosophy, everything for me, nothing for you. You see them all gobbling up each other to get market share. Nobody else can make a living, they have to have it all, and they pretty well do. Patriotism, very bad to say anything nasty about patriotism. Patriotism isn't a virtue, it's a pathological condition. Patriotism is based upon the idea, everything for us, nothing for them. The bumper sticker says, God bless America. The other hidden sticky side says, and fuck everyone else. Democracy, try to say anything bad about democracy. I don't know about you, but I don't want to eat in a restaurant where the dishwashers elect the chef and tell him how to cook. That's when it works reasonably well. What we have is not democracy, and it wasn't democracy to start off with. It was a republic, but it wasn't a very reasonably based republic, but it was, if you get into it, it was better than it looks. Anyway, that's that. Technology is a mixed bag. Even I, registered Luddite, would rather go to a 21st century dentist than a 21st dynasty dentist, even though their medicine was pretty good. Technology really does have its good side, but it also has its terrifying side, which people tend not to, and it is, unfortunately, it is in principle amoral, and in practice, much of the time, immoral. Most of our glossy technology, shiny barbarism I call it, and Chuck goes along with me on this. He's a scientist, remember, and a good one. And we don't know exactly what the figure is, but we were talking about what percentage of science or technology is actually devoted to so-called defense, which is really offense. And he wasn't sure either, but it's probably somewhere around 70 or 80%. And the rest of it is devoted, the majority of it, to frivolity, to bobblehead dolls and striped toothpaste, and a little bit left over that maybe is useful somewhere or another. The internet fits into that little bit, and thank God for that, because otherwise we'd already be cooked. And the fifth one, entertainment. Entertainment is something you do to kill time before it kills you. And entertainment is not art. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is not entertainment, and neither is the Cathedral of Chartres or the Temple of Luxor. In between there's a gray area that's comedy. Comedy is a sort of a comedy. You can only laugh, and there are a lot of art. People have just tried to figure out what it is that makes things funny. The dog doesn't think that anything's funny. Even dolphins and higher primates don't tell jokes, at least as far as we know, much less invent them. Comedy is strictly human, I think. And what it depends upon is that it depends upon an inner sense of what is right and what is wrong. There's a morality to it. I had briefly, nobody would pay me any money for it, but I had briefly I did a stand-up act called Stand-Up Metaphysics 2.0. And it was pretty funny, but except it was ragged, just as this is. But it worked okay. I mean, audiences liked it. And it was not just casual, because there's an inbuilt hierarchical, I hate to call it moral because it conjures up some crazy minister somewhere. It conjures up, but it's call it moral, for lack of a better word at the moment, and it conjures that. What? Sorry. Oh, sorry. And it conjures the. You can only put it this way: you can only laugh at what's wrong. So by laughing, you're automatically you're automatically acknowledging what is right. You cannot laugh at good sex or good food. You can make fun of attitudes toward good sex or good food, but you can't laugh at it. You can only laugh at stuff that's wrong, which is why it's such a rich age for comedians. Unfortunately, very few of them recognize that they're dealing with a potentially metaphysical weapon. But anyway, so there's a nice area. It's not a fine line. There's an area in entertainment, which is, as I said, it shades off into art. That's a different matter altogether. There's an area in there where entertainment actually serves a useful purpose. Otherwise, as I said, it's just something you do to kill time before it kills you. So, this is basically the 5 cowboys. Now, this is the next one, because one thing I want to get to that I almost forgot about. Almost. Wait a minute. Go away. Okay.
Can we give it up for John Anthony West, everybody?
Okay,
Big round of applause here.
No, I got to... 5 more minutes, okay. 5 more minutes. I did not invent this. Some genius invented it when Bush stole the second election. I changed the terminology. It was originally the red states were Dumbfuckistan and the blue states were America. No, this is partisanship. The red states are greater Dumbfuckistan and the blue states are lesser Dumbfuckistan. But it is all Dumbfuckistan, and anyone who thinks differently doesn't know what he's thinking about. Quick, they're giving me 5 minutes. Esoteric. I've been working the last couple of years on a book with a friend of mine about near-death experiences, and it's come up on practically every speaker here about the experience, the transcendent experience that is the aim, the purpose of our being here on this planet. The NDE, and backtrack a bit, everybody I'm sure is familiar with the Victor Hugo line, there's one thing stronger than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come. Great line. And everyone says, yeah, that's right. But the second strongest thing in the world, Victor Hugo did not think of. The second strongest thing in the world is an idea whose time has not yet gone. And since all the armies of the world, be they financial or agricultural or scientific or scholarly or even artistic, all the armies in the world are formally or de facto in the service of the idea whose time has not yet gone. So getting the idea whose time has come to come, this is a big deal. And I forget who it was before was citing important books of the last 100 years or so. None of those books, cumulatively, they amount to something. But really, there are a couple of hundred of us here, and out there are billions of people listening to Rush Limbaugh. And so getting the idea whose time has come, and the press, the media are in the service, the armies of the media are in the service of the idea whose time has not yet gone. So what does it take to get the idea whose time has come to come? And this, it's cumulative. So just for example, supposedly, I've researched this, but I can't get a real figure on it. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom Cabin had a real effect in bringing on the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. People have been talking about the abolition of slavery for 100 years, but it hadn't been abolished. A couple of things happen that can turn the whole thing around. What we're doing here, Allen's, amazing decoding of Shakespeare and finding all of these constants in the Great Pyramid. Go into your local Walmart and try and talk to them about Allen's discovery. It's not going to work. Even the mystery of the Sphinx, which got to millions and millions of people because we put it in such a way that everyone really could understand it. It was not abstract science. We can only get to a certain number of people. The NDE is a very strange phenomenon. And this friend of mine, I co-wrote the book. I edited the book. He was doing all of this research. His name was David Solomon. He was a Christian pastor, very unusual one, because he was actually a practicing Christian rather than a preaching Christian. There's a big difference between them for the most part. And he was doing all of this very careful research into the phenomenon of the NDE, trying to kind of categorize, to make sense of it all. And then he started losing his balance. He discovered he had a glioblastoma. It's a 100% lethal brain cancer. And originally, when he told me about his research, he financed our trip to Göbekli Tepe for Shock and myself. And I was telling him, you got to write a book, David. He's, no, I'm not a writer. With this 100% fatal cancer, he then decided, he said, well, yeah, this is my mission now. I've got to finish this book before I go. They gave him 12 to 14 months. He lasted 3 years, not quite 3 years. And we got the book done. But it seems to me, the NDE is something you don't have to use. You don't need any science for the NDE. These scientists, needless to say, the debunkers are busy trying to debunk it, saying that it's a hallucination of the deteriorating mind. Well, they're the ones with deteriorated minds, and they don't know what a hallucination is. Try to define and try to measure a hallucination and turn it into science. You can't do it. Anyway, so we got this book out there, and it seems to me that it could be, or anyway, the NDE phenomenon, this experience that normal or ordinary people who have not meditated for 20 years or fasted or done any of the, let's say, the spiritual practices that normally are associated with spiritual development, suddenly get thrust into one of the higher realms. And they haven't taken any drugs to get there either. Not that there's anything wrong with taking the drugs. But they get there, and it's only for a couple of minutes, and they come back with all of these fantastic accounts, which in fact corroborate the funerary literature of the world since time has begun. And this is material that anybody can grasp. And it seems to me that science is to a certain extent losing its vice-like grip on the strangulating, strangle grip on our throats. It's losing it anyhow. But it's going to take a lot, or something dramatic to make it come. And it seems to me that the NDE experience is something that anybody can understand and resonate to.
One more time for John Anthony West, everybody.